Have you ever finally stood up to a controlling parent, only to have them try to burn your entire life to the ground? Imagine the pure panic of logging into your bank account, just days before your wedding, and realizing your own mother secretly canceled the venue, the food, and the flowers. $18,000, completely gone. She wanted to teach her daughter a painful lesson about who was really in charge. She was ready to play the tragic, crying victim for the whole town. But she completely underestimated the quiet, unstoppable power of a best friend. Because while the mother was busy destroying the wedding, the maid of honor was already 6 months deep into executing the perfect revenge. It started 2 years ago in the quiet, friendly town of Pineville. Sarah and David had just gotten engaged. David was a gentle, patient soul. To give you an idea of the kind of man he was, he spent 3 whole months carefully restoring an old, broken 1950s record player by hand, just so Sarah could finally listen to her late grandmother's favorite gospel vinyls. They were simple people who wanted a simple wedding. They pictured a relaxed afternoon at the local community center. They wanted to serve comforting, home-style roasted chicken and decorate the tables with simple $15 bundles of baby's breath from the Sunday farmer's market. But Sarah's mother, Brenda, was a woman who lived entirely for the approval of other people. To Brenda, a wedding was not about two people falling in love, it was a stage play to show off to the neighbors. The very day after the engagement was announced, the suffocating control began. Brenda did not yell. Toxic people rarely do. Instead, she used emotional blackmail. When Sarah happily mentioned the community center and the roasted chicken, Brenda clutched her chest, her eyes instantly filling with practiced, heavy tears. "Oh, Sarah," she sighed, her voice shaking just enough to make her daughter feel terrible. "After all the sacrifices I made raising you by myself, you want to serve cheap chicken to my friends from the church board? Don't I deserve just one single day to be proud of you in front of this town?" To keep the peace, Sarah gave in just a little bit. But when you give a controlling person an inch, they take your whole life. Within 2 weeks, the cozy wedding was completely hijacked. Brenda quietly canceled the $500 community center deposit behind their backs. She instead booked the grand ballroom at the Pineville Country Club for a staggering $6,200. The simple baby's breath was thrown out, replaced by towering, scentless white lilies that cost $3,400. The comforting chicken dinner was swapped for a stiff, formal salmon dish that David was actually allergic to. Even the guest list went from 40 close friends to over 200 of Brenda's acquaintances. Sarah felt totally trapped, forced to smile on the sidelines while her mother built a monument to her own ego. When a controlling person realizes they are losing their grip, they do not apologize. Instead, they try to isolate you. Brenda knew that David was a quiet, steady anchor for Sarah. He did not get angry, but he also did not bend to Brenda's dramatic size. So Brenda decided she needed to drive a wedge between them. One Tuesday afternoon, while Sarah was working her shift at the local library, Brenda invited David over to her house for coffee. She sat him down at her spotless oak dining table, folded her hands, and put on her most concerned, tragic face. She told David that she felt it was her Christian duty to warn him about Sarah's state of mind. 3 years ago, when Sarah's beloved grandmother passed away, Sarah had very sensibly gone to a grief counselor. It was a healthy choice to process her sadness, but Brenda twisted this completely. She pulled out an old crumpled receipt for those $90 an hour therapy sessions and slid it across the table. In a hushed, pitying whisper, she told David that Sarah was deeply mentally unstable, fragile, and completely unfit to handle the pressures of marriage or planning a wedding. But Brenda severely underestimated David. He did not panic. He simply placed his coffee mug gently on the coaster, looked his future mother-in-law right in the eye, and quietly said, "Getting professional help to heal a broken heart makes Sarah the strongest woman I know." Then, he calmly stood up, put on his coat, and walked right out her front door. Furious that her plan to scare David away had completely failed, Brenda turned to her next weapon: the town of Pineville itself. In a small town, a rumor is like a lit match in dry grass. Brenda began her smear campaign right in the third pew of the First Methodist Church. Before Sunday service even started, she leaned over to the town gossips, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. She whispered that the wedding stress had caused Sarah to suffer a terrible mental breakdown. She claimed that she was being forced to take over the entire wedding, including the massive country club bill, because Sarah was simply sitting at home, staring blankly at the walls. It did not take long for the poison to spread. A few days later, Sarah was at the grocery store buying milk when a neighbor approached her with a deeply pitying look. The neighbor patted Sarah's arm and whispered, "You just go home and rest your mind, dear. Your mother told us all about your little episode. Thank goodness she's strong enough to handle everything for you." Sarah did not know it yet, but that neighbor's pity was absolute proof of Brenda's fear. When a toxic person cannot control you, they try to control how other people see you. Sarah stood frozen in the grocery store aisle, holding a carton of milk, feeling completely suffocated by her mother's lies. There is a very specific kind of silence that falls over a room when your entire world collapses. For Sarah and David, that deafening silence arrived on a rainy Thursday morning, exactly 7 days before they were supposed to walk down the aisle. Sarah was sitting quietly at her small kitchen table, sipping plain black tea and going over the final seating chart when her phone softly buzzed. It was a brief, highly apologetic email from the manager at the Pineville Country Club. It read, "Dear Sarah, we are confirming the cancellation of your reservation for the grand ballroom, as formally requested by your mother, Brenda, yesterday afternoon. We have already released the date to another party." Sarah's heart dropped heavily into her stomach. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely unlock her phone to call the florist. The line rang 3 times before the owner picked up. In a highly confused voice, the florist explained that Brenda had called the day before to say the wedding was entirely called off due to a sudden family tragedy. They had officially canceled the $3,400 order of white lilies. Panic rising tight in her throat, Sarah dialed the caterer. The answer was exactly the same. The $4,800 formal salmon dinner was gone. Everything was gone. Brenda had not just taken over the wedding. When she finally realized she could not break Sarah and David apart with her cruel town gossip, she decided to simply burn the entire event to the ground. She waited until the very last minute to completely pull the rug out from under them. Because Brenda's name was on all the vendor contracts as the primary contact, she had the complete legal power to cancel every single thing. But the absolute worst part was not the missing flowers or the empty, expensive ballroom. It was the money. When Sarah logged into their joint bank account, she saw the devastating truth. The non-refundable $6,200 ballroom deposit, the florist penalty, the catering cancellation fee. Brenda's ultimate sabotage had left them with absolutely no wedding and $18,000 completely drained from their modest savings. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, watching the rain hit the window glass, feeling completely broken. She put her face in her hands and wept. She felt like she had failed David, failed herself, and let her abuser win the ultimate victory. She reached for her phone to call David and tell him it was all over. But right at that exact moment, there was a firm, steady knock at her front door. Through the rain-streaked kitchen window, she saw a familiar, beat-up blue station wagon pull into her driveway. It was her best friend and maid of honor, Eleanor. Eleanor did not bother ringing the doorbell. She used her spare key and walked right into the kitchen. She took one look at Sarah's shaking shoulders and the glowing phone screen showing the completely drained bank accounts, and she understood instantly. Eleanor did not gasp in shock. She did not offer empty, pitying words. Instead, she quietly pulled out a wooden dining chair, sat down, and placed a thick, bright yellow folder right in the middle of the table with a reassuring thud. "I knew it," Eleanor said softly, her voice incredibly steady and calm. "I knew Brenda was going to burn it all down." Sarah just stared at her, completely confused and emotionally exhausted. Eleanor gently opened the bright yellow folder. Inside was a neat stack of carefully organized receipts and contracts. She slowly pushed the first piece of paper toward Sarah. It was a signed contract for the Pineville Community Center, the exact warm, wooden-floored hall Sarah and David had originally wanted so badly. It was dated 6 months ago. The deposit of $500 was clearly stamped paid in full. The very moment your mother forced you to change the venue to that stuffy country club, Alina explained, standing up to pour Sarah a fresh, hot cup of tea, I knew she would eventually use it as a weapon against you. Controlling people always need an exit strategy to punish you if you ever stop playing their game. So, I took my own savings and booked your dream venue as a backup. Just in case. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned to the next page in the folder. There was a confirmed receipt from Smitty's Hometown Barbecue for exactly $1,200, guaranteeing enough slow-roasted chicken and comforting sides to feed 40 people. Right behind it was a handwritten invoice from the Sunday Farmers Market for fresh, cheerful baby's breath and simple yellow daisies. Alina had watched Brenda's toxic, attention-seeking behavior for years. She understood the true, destructive nature of narcissism. So, as a fiercely loyal protector, Alina had quietly stepped into the shadows. She had spent exactly $1,850 of her own money, secretly securing the simple, beautiful wedding Sarah and David actually deserved all along. The heavy, suffocating weight that had been crushing Sarah's chest for months suddenly cracked wide open. The tears that fell down her cheeks now were not from despair. They were tears of immense, profound relief and liberation. Brenda thought she had taken away everything, but she had entirely forgotten one crucial detail. She had severely underestimated the quiet, unstoppable power of a best friend's love. With exactly 6 days left until the wedding, Alina put her master plan into action. She did not just save the wedding, she orchestrated a brilliant, flawless decoy. Alina sat at her kitchen table with a simple prepaid phone and the master guest list of 197 people. She sent a polite, cheerful message to every single guest on that list, with one glaring exception: Brenda. The message simply read, "Wonderful news. Sarah and David's wedding has been moved to the lovely Pineville Community Center. Same time, casual dress code." She made sure to include all of Brenda's Bridge Club friends and the local politicians. Alina knew exactly what she was doing. She was systematically dismantling the controlling mother's audience, one text message at a time. But Alina went one step further. When Brenda had called the florist to cancel, Alina, who knew the florist well, had asked him to save the voicemails. She now had a crystal-clear recording of Brenda laughing and admitting she was canceling the wedding simply to teach Sarah a lesson. When Saturday afternoon finally arrived, the contrast in the town was absolutely striking. At the Pineville Community Center, the air smelled richly of the slow-roasted barbecue chicken. The late afternoon sun poured through the large, open windows. David's older brother was sitting on a wooden stool in the corner, gently plucking a warm, familiar melody on a worn-out acoustic guitar. Sarah stood in the doorway, breathing easily, holding her humble bundle of yellow daisies. She wasn't trembling with anxiety anymore. Surrounded by the people who genuinely loved her, the heavy, suffocating weight of her mother's demands was completely gone. Meanwhile, directly across town, a completely different scene was unfolding. Brenda was standing in front of her large hallway mirror, carefully adjusting an expensive dark blue silk dress. She meticulously pinned an extravagant, heavy orchid corsage to her lapel. Having secretly canceled the country club ballroom days ago, Brenda's plan was to arrive at the venue right as the guests showed up. She intended to stand in the parking lot, weeping beautifully, telling everyone that Sarah had suffered a terrible mental breakdown. Brenda grabbed her car keys, a lace handkerchief for her fake tears, and walked out the door, driving straight toward a stage that had already been entirely packed up and moved without her. At exactly 4:00 p.m., a beautiful, heartfelt cheer erupted inside the Pineville Community Center. David gently kissed his new wife, and the warm room filled with the joyful sound of 197 people clapping. Sarah was finally free. At that exact same moment, 3 miles away across town, Brenda's heavy luxury car pulled slowly into the grand parking lot of the Pineville Country Club. She turned off the engine, tightly gripping her expensive lace handkerchief, completely ready to put on the tragic performance of a lifetime. She stepped out of her car, expecting to see a massive crowd of confused, disappointed guests waiting helplessly by the locked ballroom doors. But as she stood there, proudly adjusting her heavy orchid corsage, she was met with something she absolutely did not plan for: total, deafening silence. There were no cars. There were no guests. The only sound in the massive, empty parking lot was the low, steady buzzing of the late summer cicadas in the nearby trees. Just then, the country club manager walked out of the front doors. He did not look sympathetic. He handed Brenda a stiff, white envelope. Inside was a final bill for the $6,200 cancellation penalty. Because she had signed the final paperwork as the primary contact, she was entirely responsible for the debt. Brenda's perfectly manicured hands began to shake. She pulled out her phone, frantically opening her social media page. Right there at the top of her screen was a bright, happy photo posted by the mayor's wife, Brenda's biggest social rival. The photo showed the mayor happily eating dinner at the community center, laughing loudly as David and Sarah danced under simple, glowing string lights. Furious, deeply humiliated and panicked, Brenda sped across town to the community center. She slammed her car door and marched directly toward the warm, brightly lit wooden front doors, fully intending to cause a massive scene. But as she reached the bottom of the front steps, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a neat black suit stepped firmly in her path. It was Aliner's uncle, a retired police officer. "Excuse me," Brenda snapped, her voice shrill and desperate as she pointed a shaking finger toward the door. "I am the mother of the bride. You need to move out of my way right now." The older man did not blink. He simply crossed his arms, looked down at her expensive silk dress, and said in a very calm, flat tone, "I'm sorry, ma'am. You are not on the guest list. And since your name is on the country club cancellation bill, I suggest you head to the bank before Monday. Now I have to ask you to turn around and leave the property immediately." For the very first time in her entire life, Brenda had absolutely no power. She could hear the beautiful acoustic guitar playing inside. She could hear the joyful laughter of the very town she had tried so hard to manipulate. Standing completely alone on the dark sidewalk, clutching her useless lace handkerchief, Brenda finally realized the cold, heavy truth. In her desperate attempt to ruin her daughter's life, she had completely ruined her own. The Sunday morning after the wedding was the most peaceful day Sarah had ever experienced. She sat at her small kitchen table with David, drinking warm, comforting chamomile tea. There was still one final string left to cut. Sarah pulled out a single sheet of plain, white-lined paper and a simple black pen. She wrote exactly 3 short, clear paragraphs stating that Brenda was no longer allowed to contact them or interfere in their marriage. The very next morning, she paid $4.35 to send it by certified mail. That little green postal receipt was the ultimate proof of her newly protected boundaries. With the emotional boundary firmly in place, David and Sarah tackled the financial sabotage. Armed with their original contracts and Aliner's recording of Brenda admitting to the malicious cancellation, they walked straight into the local branch of the Pineville Community Bank. They sat down with the bank manager and played the audio file. It proved that Brenda had committed a bad faith, unauthorized action to drain the joint account. Because of this undeniable evidence, the bank initiated a complete fraud reversal. Within 30 days, every single penny of their lost $18,000 was safely and permanently returned to their modest savings account, leaving Brenda entirely responsible for the penalties she signed for. Meanwhile, Brenda was left to face the very town she had tried so hard to manipulate. The mayor's wife quietly removed Brenda from the church's Sunday hospitality committee. Without any loud shouting or public arguments, the town simply closed its doors to her. The elaborate, tragic lie she had tried to sell about Sarah's mental breakdown had completely backfired. By trying to publicly ruin her daughter, Brenda had permanently destroyed her own carefully polished reputation. Today, Sarah and David are deeply happy. They do not have a massive mansion, and they do not care about impressing the neighbors. They have a warm, safe home, a loyal chosen family, and the absolute beautiful freedom to finally write their own story.